Hi, I'm Steve Gathercool. Welcome to my time-lapse video of a pyrography parrot I completed recently. There is also a bit of real time about halfway through. Hope you enjoy. Thank you. Well, here we go, starting straight off with the eye. I tend to start with the eye, whether I'm doing an airbrush painting or pyrography or whatever. It can easily make or break the artwork, depending on if you get the eye right or not. Now I've moved on to just starting to develop some of the smaller feathers around the top of the head. You'll notice I'll probably dart about all over the image as I start to progress. Using the, it's called a small spear shader in my wire tip tool at the moment. I like that tool because I can tip it up and use the very point to do fine hairs. I can use the flat base to do quite nice shading, or I can use the edge for some fine lines. And now I'm currently working my way back along the top of the head. This is really just the first layer of feathering. I will tend to go back and forth over the same area, gradually building up the depth. I find that using a lower heat and then going back and forth over the area is the best way to increase the depth rather than trying to go in too hot. Unfortunately, if you go in too hot, you tend to burn the wood quite deeply. You can get some bleed as well, which doesn't look nice, and I don't think there's anywhere near as much control over the overall tones and particularly the shadows as well. But this looks like it's fairly quick, doesn't it, at the moment with time lapse, but I have introduced a little bit of real time as we get further in, so you can see how slow the actual process is. You may or may not know, if you know me, I'm fairly new to pyrography. I've primarily been using an airbrush for a few years now, and then decided to have a little go at pyrography. I'd seen it, and one of my daughters bought me a kit for Christmas. I thought I'd give it a go. That initial piece of kit was a solid tip burner, which looks very much like a soldering iron, and although I got on quite well with that unit, I then progressed to using a wire tip setup. Basically that means there's a piece of wire between the electrodes that heats up and cools down much quicker than a solid tip. And there's a much bigger variety as well of different tips that you can use. Well, here we are. I've now moved on to part of the face. It's a bit difficult, this area, because there seems to be lots of sort of wrinkly lines and whatever all over the skin of the face, which is quite difficult to actually show in the video. But I sort of got there in the end, as you'll see in a minute. We're just doing part of the beak now. As you can see, yet again I've flicked back and forth across the drawing, and now I'm trying to go back and add a bit more shading in areas that I've been to before. The reason for that is that as you start to add more and more dark areas, it makes the areas that you've already done look a bit lighter, and you can see where some of the tones are not quite right, so you'll go back in and darken them. I'm just starting on some of the finer feathers here. This is where I have to use the very tip of the burner itself and try and do some very fine lines to build up the hairs. And again, even with these fine lines, I go back and forth over the same area to get a bit of shading and depth in there. Slowly working my way around it. And now I've jumped back again to just around the face area. And in a minute now we'll come up there. We'll come up to some slow real time. Now this here is real time, so now you will actually see how slow the process is. I'm slowly drawing in the detail. I'm using a relatively low heat, but if I keep the tip in the same area for a little while, it will get darker the longer I hold the tip there. So the trick is to not only select the right heat, but also a heat that is suitable for the speed you're using. If I have a very high heat and then very quickly move the tip across, you won't get such a deep burn. But moving it quickly, you're not going to be able to maintain the detail you want. So I tend to have a lower heat and slowly move the tip. And as you can see, it's quite fine and quite light, the lines at the moment. But as I slow down, they will get darker. And you'll see, if you look carefully, you'll see I do slow the stroke down at one point. And that actually gives me a slightly darker line. Now I'm going back over the area I just did. So that darkens up a bit more. I tend to go over the same area with more lines rather than just put the flat shader in place and shade it flat. I think that adding extra lines to give you that depth and going over the same area is much better than just shading an area. So I very rarely actually use the shading capability of the tip. More than anything, I tend to just keep going over the same area. You do find though that as you go back over an area you've already burnt, that you do need to raise the temperature a little bit or hold the tip there longer. Now just starting to build up a bit more of that depth of feathers around the beak. Now I'm going back over the start again to introduce a bit of shading at the base of those feathers. And that's just putting more lines in the same place rather than trying to shade with the flat of the tip. And now going around the top of that first line of small feathers, which will give me a darker area at the base of the next row of feathers. Here we go, just put a few more lines in of the next row of feathers. These fine feathers are more like hair than feathers around this particular area. I do tend to find that there's not a lot of difference between feathers and hair on a lot of the birds. You seem to use the same process because they are very, very similar to look at. We're getting near the end of the real-time bit I put in. I just thought it would be useful for people to see how slow the process actually is. And this is just a small piece of pyrography here. It's actually a coaster from a set that I'm currently putting together for my wife. She wants 8 coasters and 8 placemats. So I'm doing 16 different birds altogether. And these little 100mm coasters, you know, they're actually quite quick to do in comparison. And now we're back to the time lapse again. As I was saying, these coasters, they're 100mm square, and I'm using birch plywood. I will, after these are finished, coat them with a heat-proof clear lacquer, the stuff that used in the automotive industry for things like brake calipers and engines and exhaust manifolds, so it should stand the heat of a hot cup without sticking or melting the coating. Now there's more of these very fine lines, wrinkly type lines around the skin. I found this quite awkward to work out how to do, so I just kept going over the areas where I want a little bit more shading in there till it started to stand out. I apologise for all the shadows all over the place. I haven't quite got my lighting sorted out yet. I'm still trying to figure out the best way to do that. I think one of these ring lights will probably be the best thing. Now round to the beak. Now here, at the moment I'm just using the tip end like random squiggly movements is the best way to explain it, to give me some of the texture of a rather battered and scratched beak. And then when we get to the darker areas, this is one of the times when I do crank the heat up a bit more and just keep going over the same area, because I need really dark burning here to give that look of a black beak. Obviously we can't get black with pyrography, it's just a very, very dark brown. But although you can't see, there's actually smoke coming up from the wood at the moment because I have the heat so high. Then I'll drop the heat down again to start doing the areas that are not quite as dark. But he's starting to come together a bit now. I find that it can, the handle itself can get a little bit warm if you have the heat raised for quite a while. Not warm enough for me to need wearing a protective glove or anything like that. But as I tend to not use a high heat very often at all, it doesn't really bother me. And now I'll go back to small feathers again. These are slightly larger feathers. As you'll notice, I always tend to use the method of not drawing the outline of the feathers. More, I'll tend to use the tip to define where the edges of the feathers are by using little strokes, and then fill in the main body of the feather. Obviously, if I'd have drawn the outline, it wouldn't look right. It wouldn't look as natural as I'd want it to be. So all I tend to do is sketch the outline of the feather first with little tiny lines, as you can see here, little tiny strokes, and then go and fill in the body of the feather. Then add the shading, which might be sort of one side of the feather, but certainly always be from the base of the feather, because that's where there'll always be a little bit of shadow, and again that tends to give you the depth. Now slowly walking around the smaller feathers at the top of his wing, you just make out to where his wing starts and finishes. It's a rather scruffy looking parrot, but I think that's a macaw actually. But here you get a better idea of how the feathers are burnt. I darken the edges first, then fill in the middle, and then do the shadows at the bottom. And again, I'll go back and forth with the same areas to build up the shading, build up the depth. And then once I've finished the parrot himself, I'll go all the way around the outside edge and burn a border to finish it off again, hopefully maintaining the handcrafted look, which is what I'm trying to do. Here we go. I've changed the tip actually to a ball tip, and you can see how hot I've had to turn the temperature up now, because you can just see the tip is starting to glow red, and you will see the smoke coming off the board. But I need that heat to get this nice dark burn for the edge. And then when this is done, we'll have the finished product. But I think that gives a nice sort of handcrafted look to it. And there's the finished product. Thanks for watching.